Hi, good morning. We are here with Aline Remael today for an interview. So Agnieszka, over to you.
Yes, good morning. Aline, first of all, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. You are a Professor Emeritus at the University of Antwerp in the Department of Applied Linguistics, Translator and Interpreter, and you're also a recipient of the Jan Iversen Award for your lifelong dedication to developing the field of audiovisual translation and commitment to furthering research on media accessibility. And you have also authored a number of publications on AVT and on media accessibility. And we were hoping you would tell us perhaps how your journey into AVT and media accessibility began.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to start with. I'd be happy to tell you a few things. I had to look them up because it all seems rather far away how I started. Being a Belgian, I've always read subtitles from the day I could read. Actually, I started reading subtitles, so they triggered my interest pretty early on. I started teaching at the university after a previous life in around 1990, and I introduced subtitling in 1993. In between, I learned the practice of subtitling, and for that, I went to the University of Ghent, where they were teaching it at undergraduate level, only practice, because they were subtitling the Ghent Film Festival, which was, and I think still is, the biggest one in Belgium. And that undergraduate course was taught by Herman Brondeel, who was one of the very first members of ESIST, but who retired very shortly after that.
Anyway, yeah, and I think he also had a paper in Meta about the experience in
at the time. It was his one paper, but it was a very useful one. It was quoted a lot at the time, and he was a very good teacher and practitioner. But yeah, it was certainly very useful for me. So I took the knowledge back to my university and we introduced subtitling in 1993. And I think my story, my research, but especially my relationship with the university, is one of a researcher activist. I seem to be good at convincing people. So first I convinced them to buy one Cavenas subtitling unit. That was in 93. Then we bought 4. Then we got Swift in all the labs. Then we got, what was it called, wing caps, and now finally Q4. So that's been a long evolution, but we started with the one there. And then my research started immediately at the time. And in that respect, also ESIST was important. And I'm not sure whether it was Herman Brondeel or Yves Gambier who introduced me to ESIST, because I gave my first talk on subtitling in 1995. And that was at the EST conference in Prague. And it was a talk on subtitling documentaries, which was a bit unusual at the time because most initial research was on fiction. But that was already due to my watching subtitles on VRT. And I'd watched the documentary on BBC, happened to see it was being broadcast on VRT afterwards, watched it, and saw that they cut and pasted a lot of things. It was a completely different documentary. So I wondered, what did they do with the language? What did they do with the subtitling? So it was a kind of discourse analysis approach. And that was my very first one. And Yves was my chair at EST in Prague. So I think that's how I entered ESIST. Then in the 90s, shortly after that, I started then attending ESIST meetings, also in Düsseldorf. I went one where Josephine Dries was chairing. That's where I met Jorge, Diacintas, Mary Carroll, again, Yves Gambier, Helwen James, and many others. And this was very important because back in Belgium, practice was important, but there was no research whatsoever. I was a bit of an oddity, even at my university, for wanting to do research in subtitling, and also within translation studies, it was looked down on. So the support from colleagues was very important for research, but also for practice, because also at ESIST, I met Corinne Imhauser, who was at the time teaching subtitling at ISTI, a French translator school in Brussels, although she was an interpreter and moved out of the field later. We got in touch at the ESIST meetings, and after that our students produced bilingual subtitles for the Animation Film Festival in Brussels together. So mine did the Dutch, hers did the French, and we joined them in bilingual subtitles. And for the students, it was an exercise in management and language communication, because they didn't study French, they studied English actually with me. They had to communicate with the French students and they had to communicate with the Flemish students. It was really very interesting. And we did that for many years. And then also I made the first contacts for later project research. So for me, all this networking right from the beginning was very important, not just at ESIST, but also then at Languages in the Media. I think my first Languages in the Media was 1998, I'm not sure, it was I think the second one, I'm not entirely sure. And then of course came In So Many Words in London, where Transmedia was established. So I became a member of the Transmedia Research Group, which was also important as a move. Then the Media for All conferences started. And the third was in Antwerp in 2009, the third Media for All, and it's coming back to Antwerp now. The next one will be in Antwerp again. So as for my personal research, it started really in subtitling, but my PhD was in film adaptation and screenwriting and film dialogue. So from there I evolved into audio description and live subtitling as well as subtitling inter and intralingually. So I've actually covered the spectrum of AVT. I didn't stay with subtitling. I did in the beginning, but then moved on from there. So yeah, how's that for an introduction?
Yeah, it's a very interesting journey. I mean, very, very fascinating. And I was thinking that you have everything in this journey. You have the practice and supporting practice, having students that are trained and then become professionals, and the development of research, and so many important figures that you've mentioned. It's all so very interesting. And I was actually fascinated by your own definition of, you have defined yourself as a researcher, research activist, which is, I think, very true and also very interesting, and it leads us perhaps to our next question, which is about audiovisual translation research. We know that it's always been very strongly connected with the practice of audiovisual translation, and you yourself, I mean, you're an example of developing training and also working in practical terms on, many projects and different fronts. So how do you see audiovisual translation has evolved over the years? I mean, where does it come from in terms of research? Does it come from linguistics? How did audiovisual translation enter translation studies? I think this happened when translation studies was still mainly anchored to literary translation. So how do you trace this evolution of AVT in terms of academic research?
Yeah, I think it's a story of many different inroads. In subtitling and maybe also in audio description, I think initial research started with the practitioners. So the initial research was done by people in the field, because I remember my first contacts with VRT, with the public broadcaster in Flanders, were through their subtitling department. I went there with my students to see what they were doing, and they were really well advanced in subtitling and they did a lot of good work, but they did no research. Whereas some private practitioners who came out of VRT started doing research. And it was through these contacts that we developed projects together. And actually the same happened with AD and maybe also live subtitling, except that at that time, at least in Flanders, for subtitling, live subtitling with speech recognition around 2001, VRT was experimenting. And I went to VRT regularly for my students and for maintaining my contacts. And I thought, we have to do something about this because this is the right time. So I talked to one of my colleagues in the interpreting department, and we started experimenting with Dragon and Swift at the time, trying it out, learning it ourselves, and then launched a course outside the curriculum. As I said, I keep convincing people, so I convinced the head of department saying we need this course. And then she said, well, you can go ahead and do it, but I can't just introduce it into the curriculum. I said, yeah, well, I'll ask if anybody's interested and we'll give them a certificate. So I sent messages out to the interpreting students and 4 joined the course. And that set off both practice and research, because as we were teaching, we were doing research into what needed to be taught. So I went back and forth to VRT and met a colleague of mine at VRT. I'm making this very practical, but this is how it worked, you know, who was from the economics department doing research, doing writing research with speech recognition. And he was at VRT because they were the only ones using speech recognition professionally at the time. We're speaking early 2000s, 2001. So we got together and we got a project from the university fully funded for 2 years for a full-time researcher. So through this interaction, both research and teaching and practice evolved. And I think that's very typical for the beginning of audiovisual. For AD, it was even more remarkable because I'd learned about AD. For instance, I think at the In Many Words conference in London, mostly. I'd heard about it before, but didn't know it very well. Got very interested, convinced the school to start with AD before anybody was doing it in Belgium. I was convinced it would start on TV, but they weren't doing it. So we started teaching, we started researching, and by the time they needed them, we got the graduates.
You were very lucky to receive a lot of institutional support. On the one hand, from the university.
Mind you.
Yes, and also there was a lot of trust between the academia, University of Antwerp, and the broadcaster, because I assume that nowadays not everybody can gain this trust. There are lots of issues related to copyright, etc. So you're very lucky to establish this connection.
Yeah, they were always very generous providing material. And of course, what is very important in developing, whether it's research or teaching, you need a few motivated people. At a certain time, I was giving talks to blind associations and to VHD top-notch people about what AD is, because nobody knew. Then the subtitling and live subtitling team got very interested and they supported me in promoting it within their organization. They gave me material. Our students described it. An NGO making talking books for the blind recorded everything fairly professionally. We shipped it back to VSD. They sent it to their directors and eventually they started audio description. But I'm deviating a bit from Elena's question.
No, I think this is a very successful story, and I was thinking that you managed to convince, as an activist, your institution to train audio describers when audio description was not practiced, which is very hard, and then it turned out to be the right choice. But we received, I mean, my own university or Italian institutions would always ask, do we need a course for this? Do we need to train people to do this? Is there a market for these people? So that's fantastic because you were there with your trained students just in time for.
But I must say you have to do it. You have to convince people and then do it a bit surreptitiously, because I started doing subtitling, intralingual English-Dutch. Then a few hours went to SDH within that course, although it was English-Dutch, but nobody knew, so fine. Then I go on, it has to be expanded, so workshops were taught by VHD. Then I even added AD to that course, in the course, until I said, oh, this is exploding, I haven't got enough hours, so the course was split. And that evolved into subtitling, not just for English, but practically all the languages. AD in Dutch and live subtitling went to interpreting.
Yes,
And
may I jump in here? Because I think University of Antwerp is actually one of the institutions that provided the earliest courses on audiovisual translation from what you're saying. I don't know how far back it goes. You said 1990s, was that?
no, VRT started in 2001. Well, they started before with other forms. They experimented with velotype, they experimented with typing, and I was there when they were trying it out. There was one person typing like mad and another one listening to the broadcast and dictating, so that at least the input would be clearer, but they realized that was no good. In the Netherlands, they were using velotype, so VRT tried out velotype, decided against it because of the stiff learning curve. It takes forever to learn, and then people get fed up and leave. So then they decided we're going for live speech recognition, sorry. So I saw the evolution was there when they started experimenting, and that's when we said, okay, now we do this too, we have to do this too.
Yes, and you mentioned you kept adding some different types of AVT to the curriculum, but what kind of, perhaps you can give us an idea, where does it sit in the program? Is it a master program? In what exactly? How does it sit institutionally?
Yeah, because I saw that in Ghent they had subtitling in the bachelor's, but it was really limited to, okay, we're doing this film festival and that's it, and the students enjoyed it. I thought, oh, the students enjoy this very much. This is going to attract students. Was also my motivation initially, to be honest. But we started with it immediately actually we started with master thesis. I had a couple of master theses between 1990 and 1993 already doing subtitling. Then in 93, the course was integrated in the master in translation. And the multiplication of courses into SDH, AD, and eventually media accessibility is now a course. Plus there was a theoretical course to support them all. That's all in the Master of Translation. The only course that went to the Master in Interpreting is live subtitling. However, the course also relied on the subtitling course in that we made provisions for these interpreters to follow my subtitling course. So they took live subtitling but were required to take subtitling within the language of their choice, because by then we had it from French, English, German, and Italian, I think.
There's something else in this fantastic success story that you've been tracing. And in your being a research activist, you were essential in establishing OPEN, which is a center that you called Expertise Center for Accessible Media and Culture. Yes. So what is OPEN and what does it do and how strong it is?
Yeah. Is it okay if I go back a bit and explain how this happened? Yeah. I've been talking about PhD a lot, but the very first subtitling course, live subtitling course, I should say, that was outside the curriculum, that was attended by 4 students. One of them was Veerle Haverhals. The year she came out, that was 2007, as an interpreter with live subtitling, she was hired by the then most important private TV company, the competitor of VHD, and she's now head of live subtitling there. So we also developed collaboration with the private companies. Apart from that, and then mostly through AD, we started collaborating with theatres and opera, as you well know, Elena, because you came to one of the first meetings we had with opera and helped them introduce AD. Then this was getting known, and our students were doing AD after they graduated here and there, occasionally in theatres and cultural centres. And we were getting so many requests for support and questions about how to organize this, how do you organize that, that we couldn't really cope anymore. And I'm saying we, because by then we had a team. There were 2 people who'd done a PhD, Nina de Vries and Gert Kouteren, and then later Sabine Hanoule. And now we've got the first official interdisciplinary PhD, Translation Studies and Theatre Studies. Her viva will be in October for AD for the theatre. So lots of things were evolving simultaneously, not just the collaboration with VHD. And because of that, we got so many questions that we thought we can't cope. I mean, we have to do research and teach. So at one of the meetings organized by VHD, they organize annual meetings for all their stakeholders. So we were there because at the beginning we were proofreading all their ADs. Kirst and I were proofreading all the ADs for the public broadcasting when they were just beginning because they felt insecure. Now, of course, they're doing fine. And they had these meetings with us, with blind associations, deaf associations, technicians, people from their staff, all together once or twice a year. I was driving to Brussels with Nina in my car. I said, how are we going to cope with all these questions? I said, I think we need a center. I'll ask at VRT what they think. So at the meeting, I launched the idea, and I remember a few people from Blind Association, okay, where's the paper? Where do I have to sign? Because we always needed their support to get things done at university. So, oh, wait, I have to ask first. So I talked to the person at the university responsible for spin-offs. I said, we need this center for accessible media because we're getting all these requests. It would be really good for the university. It would raise its profile and would give us possibilities, but we need funding. Excellent idea. Find a project and funding. I said, no. You're going to give us funding. No, yes, no. Went on like that. Said, okay, hopeless. I said, forget it. No center. So I went to the dean instead, and the director of the faculty. Strangely enough, they said, that's a very good idea, write a project. So Nina, Kirst and I sat down, shouldn't be more than a page, wrote a page, took it to the dean, he took it to the vice chancellor of the university and the main accountant. They liked it and gave us funding full time for a whole year. Although we only asked for 30% administration, they gave us full time the whole year and then another year. And the center was launched, I have to look at the date because I haven't got that. 21st of June 2018 was the official launch. And yeah, I retired in February 19, so that was the last thing I did. And in the meantime, it's run by a whole team and it more or less pays for its own expenses. Sometimes it works better than others, but it's collaborating with all kinds of organizations, teaching workshops online, face-to-face, now more online, doing consultancy, giving support for all forms of AVT and accessibility, organizing conferences like Unlimited, online and soon also face-to-face. So that started in 18, yeah. But also, yeah, you have to convince people that you're right somehow, yeah.
Not always easy, but...
No, good motivation and a lot of support. We, by then it was certainly had been we for a long time, got a lot of support from not just the broadcasters, but also the users. Much support. Also in the form of, lots of participants for tests. Students or we were in a project. We needed blind or visually impaired people to take part in experiments. Just pick up a phone and get them because they were so happy with the results.
Yeah.
So
I think, Aline,
yeah.
You've set an example for us all in how to cooperate with all the major stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So how to connect the academia with the industry as well as with the end users. And I think it's a great example for us all.
About it. They always got cookies and chocolate and coffee. We always made events very pleasant as well. I mean, I think that helps. But it's mostly that they see it's useful and that they benefit from it and learn. I think it has to be a win-win situation.
Yeah.
And personal contacts are very important. It's always individuals or a few individuals within these organizations who get the ball rolling and have to convince people.
Yeah, it's also great to hear that the end users become great allies because they find pleasure in, working together. They trust you, and so they become first allies for further projects, and that's great.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. It's a bit more difficult with some groups than others, but as soon as people find that they benefit from it, and you have to adapt with the times, because in the beginning I realized maybe I have been may have imposed a few things on people. Said, no, you'll be better off with AD, believe me. I mean, I don't think you should do that. I don't do that anymore. And in the end, I guess in many ways I was right. But now also with the research together with theatre studies, we see that some like AD, some just prefer an introduction. Some prefer other forms of accessibility, but just want to listen to the play and don't want AD. So I think it's now that it's all there, it's time to diversify and to listen to the audiences to see how they want to diversify and to move research more into the combination of technology and creativity. And I think that's the new trend. It started in many ways from practice, then moved into translation studies. You asked about linguistics. I think some initial studies were strongly linked to linguistics to see what is the language of AD, like Nina Levy's PhD was on that. And that's then again useful because if you know what is the language of AD, you can move on to automatic translation, you can move on to machine translation and things. You need to know what the language is to see how difficult it might be to use technology. So everything's really linked and I think becoming more complex and more interesting also because of that.
That brings us to the future. How do you see the future of AVT?
Very complicated. Actually, I think it will be more and more tailor-made maybe. And my recent interest is in this conflict between media for all and design for all and individuality. And I think most of us are struggling with that a bit. I'm not sure which way it will go, but I think we shouldn't really just involve the users to see how should we do this, how should we do that, but they should, well, nothing should be done, but it might be good if they learned too, having had the experience, what they get from what, so that they can choose from a panoply of possibilities that is offered to them and don't necessarily have to use everything, because theoretically you could have audio description, audio introduction, I don't know, visiting the stage, touch tours, subtitles in 2 languages, in 3 languages, things on the tablet, but then you go mad if you have to.
But on the other hand, I'm just thinking, if you have choice, I mean, if there's choice in the way you can enjoy a performance, for example, it's better than you choose to go for a tactile tour and not for a full audio description because, so I think choice is also part of universal design, and in the end it's good. It's more expensive and it takes more time, obviously, but it goes back then to the individual's
and also participation in a more fundamental sense, like earlier on in the play or earlier on in the opera. I think it's more difficult in cinema because it's less accessible. But I think live events can show the way in that sense. So I think more and more collaborations, so more of the same thing, but on different levels, and making sure that technology doesn't impose itself, but that we manage technology the way we need it. And for my students, the past years, I've always advised them to diversify. Even within AVT, we tend to encourage them to do all of it, to do subtitling and AD and SDH, and possibly, if they can, live, although that's not always possible because it's in a different master, but still you can take electives in another master, so that's possible. And then you see that some are better at one than at the other. It's what they also do at PhD. They come in and they have to try everything, even if they haven't done live subtitling at university, and then they see what they're best at. And I think it's also important to learn to transfer your skills, because so many forms of subtitling or audiovisual translation that we have today are transferred to new contexts. So you have to learn your skills, and you learn them in one particular context, say for TV, but you have to be willing and prepared to transfer the skill to live, or to transfer them to personal meetings even with people, And I think also to video interpreting. I think there will be more convergence between AVT and interpreting because both are so virtual these days. And I think students should be aware that they have to be able to transfer to different contexts and adapt to them. Even though the skills are fundamentally the same, there will be differences that we'll have to learn en route, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes, and learn our lives, I guess.
Right. Yeah, lifelong learning. But I'm retired now.
This is fantastic, I think, because we moved from the early days to the future. So we cover the entire spectrum, which is great.
Yeah, what's also great is I had all these pages, I haven't even looked at them. So when you stop, there'll be much more, but too bad, I think.
Aline, thank you very much for your time, for sharing all your insights and tips. And I have to say, personally, the University of Antwerp seems such a great place to be in terms of...
to come to the next conference.
That's right. When we have to see you in person at the next event, whatever conference that's going to be
and
next
good
year.
luck with ESIST.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.